Chapter 1. The Arrival in Tuscany. The sun blazed high above the Italian countryside, casting a golden hue over the undulating hills of Tuscany. The air was warm and fragrant, a mix of cypress trees, lavender, and sun-baked earth, blending with the distant whispers of vineyards. Cecilia felt the pulse of adventure thrum beneath her skin as her rental car wound along the narrow, dusty roads. She had come to this secluded pocket of Italy in search of respite, a summer escape far from the tangled routine of her life in New York. The idea of spending a month in a place so far removed from her busy reality had seemed like a distant dream, but now, here she was. Rows of grapevines stretched out in all directions, like soldiers standing at attention. Olive groves framed the landscape, their silver leaves shimmering gently in the breeze. The ancient stone villas and farmhouses, covered in terracotta roofs, sat nestled among them. She drove slowly, taking in every turn of the landscape, the hills rolling like a painted canvas. Eventually, she found the driveway that led to her temporary home, a rustic farmhouse tucked between rows of cypress trees, its stone walls weathered with age, yet vibrant with life. Cecilia parked the car and stepped out, feeling the crunch of gravel beneath her sandals. She took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs, and felt the tension of the city begin to melt away. Inside the farmhouse, beams of sunlight filtered through wooden shutters, casting a pattern of light and shadow across the cool tiled floor. She wandered through the rooms, tracing her fingers along old wooden furniture, discovering a kitchen that opened onto a small courtyard and a bedroom with a window that framed the view of distant hills. The farmhouse felt like it had been waiting for her, its walls holding the secrets of summers past, echoing with the laughter of those who had stayed before her. Later, as the afternoon light deepened, Cecilia found herself wandering outside, drawn to the fields that stretched behind the farmhouse. Her footsteps brushed against the tall grasses, stirring the hum of hidden crickets. She followed a narrow path through a small grove of olive trees, her heart quickening with the excitement of the unknown. It was there, at the edge of a vineyard, that she first saw him. Luca stood a few rows away, his back to her, tending to the vines with a practiced ease. He moved with a grace born from familiarity, his hands careful as they inspected the clusters of grapes ripening in the heat. The sun had bronzed his skin, and his dark hair, tousled from the breeze, fell slightly over his forehead. There was a tranquility to his presence, as if he belonged to the land, blending seamlessly with the landscape that surrounded him. Cecilia watched him for a moment, feeling like an uninvited guest who had stumbled into a private scene. She considered turning back, retreating to the safety of her farmhouse, but something in the way he worked, the care with which he treated the vines, held her in place. She remained still, as if the land itself had conspired to keep her there, unnoticed among the shade of the olive trees. Luca shifted, his attention focused entirely on the vines. He moved from row to row, pausing to adjust the supports, his movements slow and deliberate, like someone savoring every moment spent under the Tuscan sun. Cecilia's curiosity grew, mingling with a sense of anticipation that she could not quite explain. She imagined what his life must be like, simple, untouched by the chaos that marked her own days. As the shadows lengthened, Luca finally straightened, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He glanced up, and for a fleeting moment, his eyes met hers across the distance. Cecilia's breath caught in her throat, and she took an instinctive step back, feeling the blush of embarrassment warm her cheeks. She couldn't tell if he had truly seen her, or if she was simply imagining the way his gaze lingered for a second longer than it should have. She turned, walking quickly back the way she had come, her footsteps crunching along the path with a sense of urgency. The encounter left her feeling unexpectedly flustered, as though she had intruded upon something she didn't fully understand. Back at the farmhouse, she settled onto the shaded terrace, gazing out over the rows of olive trees and vineyards that stretched toward the horizon. The warmth of the day still clung to her skin, and the quiet, punctuated only by the occasional chirp of a bird, wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of crimson and violet, Cecilia's thoughts wandered back to the man among the vines. She felt a strange sense of connection to this place, to the solitude it offered, and to the figure she had encountered by chance. Perhaps it was the freedom of being far from home, or the allure of a new beginning that came with the scent of lavender and the promise of endless summer days. Or perhaps it was simply the way Tuscany seemed to hold time in its hands, allowing each moment to stretch and unfurl, unhurried and eternal. Cecilia watched as dusk settled over the valley, the vineyards slipping into shadows. She couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow might bring. If she might find herself drawn back to the path through the olive grove, back to the quiet vineyard where a stranger's presence had stirred something deep within her. For now, she remained on the terrace, allowing the silence of the evening to weave around her, mingling with the heartbeat of a summer that had just begun. Chapter 2: Sunset over the olive groves. The next morning, the Tuscan sky opened in a sweep of brilliant blue, unbroken by clouds. The sun cast a warm glow over the hills, bathing the landscape in a golden haze. Cecilia awoke early, the crisp morning air drifting through the open window of her room, carrying with it the scent of blooming lavender from the garden below. She rose slowly, stretching out the last remnants of sleep as the birds began their song in the surrounding trees. She spent the first hours wandering the grounds of the farmhouse, exploring the corners she had missed the day before. A small stone well, covered in ivy, stood near the edge of the garden, its water glimmering darkly beneath the sunlight. Cecilia dipped her fingers into the cool liquid, feeling a childish delight at the discovery. The rhythm of her life back home was far from her thoughts, replaced by a new sense of curiosity and peace. By midday, the heat had settled over the valley, and Cecilia sought refuge under the shade of an old oak tree near the edge of the olive grove. She brought a book with her, one she had packed without much thought, but the words on the page soon blurred in the warmth of the afternoon. She closed the book, resting it on her lap, and allowed herself to simply watch as the sun filtered through the branches above, casting dappled light on the ground. Beyond the grove, the vineyard shimmered under the sun's gaze, the rows of grapevines stretching out like a green sea. Cecilia found her thoughts drifting back to the figure she had seen the day before. She wondered if he would be there again, tending to his work among the vines. She had never been one for fanciful thoughts, but something about that brief encounter had planted a seed of curiosity in her heart. It was a strange, delicate thread that pulled at her, drawing her back to the edge of the grove where the vineyard began. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, she gathered her courage and wandered down the same path, past the olive trees that swayed gently in the breeze. The air cooled slightly, the shadows stretching long across the ground, and Cecilia felt a thrill in the possibility of the unknown. She walked slowly, her steps hushed against the earth, until the vineyard opened up before her again, and there, among the rows of grapevines, she caught sight of him. Luca was crouched low, carefully examining the leaves of the vines, his fingers deftly plucking away any stray shoots that threatened the clusters of grapes. The sun's light softened as it fell across the scene, painting the vineyard in hues of amber and rose. Cecilia paused, letting the moment wash over her, observing from a distance the quiet diligence with which he worked. He moved with an ease that spoke of years spent under the sun, each motion as natural as the way the wind moved through the vines. She lingered at the edge of the grove, leaning against the rough bark of an olive tree. The vineyard's rhythmic stillness seemed to seep into her, each breath she took in sync with the rise and fall of the breeze. She closed her eyes, imagining what it would be like to be so rooted to one place, to know the land as he did, with its rhythms and secrets. It was a feeling far removed from her own life, where each day blurred into the next, filled with meetings and deadlines. Luca straightened again, lifting his gaze to the horizon as the sun dipped lower, its light spilling across the hills like liquid gold. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, his silhouette etched against the glowing sky. Cecilia watched him, her heart quickening, a pang of something unfamiliar taking hold deep within her. She felt like an outsider looking in on a scene she could never fully belong to, yet it called to her in a way she couldn't quite understand. With a quiet resolve, she stepped closer, moving through the shadows that stretched between the olive grove and the vineyard. She picked a spot a little closer than the day before, crouching low among the tall grasses that bordered the vines. She could see him better now, the lines of concentration etched on his face, the way his hands moved with a surety that came from understanding the earth. She imagined what his life must have been like, growing up in a place like this, where summers were endless and each season brought a new rhythm to the land. As the sun dipped lower, a flock of starlings suddenly burst from the nearby trees, their wings beating in a frenzied dance against the evening sky. Cecilia's gaze followed their flight, but when she looked back toward the vineyard, she found Luca standing still, his face turned in her direction, her breath caught in her throat, her heart stumbling as his eyes met hers, this time with no distance to blur the connection between them. For a moment, she thought about turning away, disappearing back into the shadows of the grove, but something held her in place. They remained like that, suspended in the quiet twilight, with only the whisper of the wind between them. His expression softened, a curious warmth in his gaze that seemed to acknowledge her presence without surprise, as if he had known all along that she had been there, watching. Slowly, he turned back to the vines, resuming his work with the same gentle precision, as if inviting her to stay, or at least to observe without fear. Cecilia felt her pulse slow, a quiet assurance settling in her chest as she remained where she was, content to watch the day melt into evening. She imagined that perhaps there was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared moment that transcended the need for words. As the last light of day faded, Luca finished his work and walked back along the rows, disappearing into the distance toward a farmhouse further down the hill. Cecilia lingered for a while longer, watching the sky change from gold to deep indigo, speckled with the first stars of night. She finally turned and made her way back to her own farmhouse, her thoughts filled with the memory of his gaze and the quiet connection they had shared. Back in the solitude of her room, Cecilia sat by the window, looking out over the vineyard now veiled in shadow. A new sense of anticipation tugged at her, as though this summer might hold something more than she had expected. She knew she would return to the grove again, and that the path between the olive trees and the vineyard would soon become familiar to her. She didn't yet understand the nature of the pull she felt, but she embraced the mystery of it, letting the promise of the days ahead settle into her like the warmth of the Tuscan sun. In the darkness, she lay back on her bed, listening to the sounds of the night, crickets singing their lullaby and the faint rustle of leaves beyond the window. A gentle breeze drifted in, carrying with it the scent of the vineyard and the memory of Luca's quiet presence among the vines. She closed her eyes, letting herself drift into sleep, her dreams filled with sunlit hills and a shadowed figure among the rows of grapes. Chapter 3: The Hidden Vineyard. The days in Tuscany began to weave themselves into a gentle rhythm. Mornings found Cecilia wandering the grounds of the farmhouse, a cup of strong espresso in hand, as she watched the valley wake to the sun's embrace. Afternoons stretched out like lazy cats beneath the warmth, inviting her to explore further along the narrow paths that twisted through the olive groves and beyond. But it was the evenings, the hours when the sun lingered just above the horizon, that held a particular magic. Those were the moments that pulled her back toward the vineyard, to the quiet presence she had discovered among the rows of ripening grapes. Each evening, she would follow the same path through the olive trees, her anticipation growing with every step. She never ventured too close, always keeping herself tucked among the shadows, a silent observer at the edge of Luca's world. She watched as he worked, tending to the vines with the same careful attention, and she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her during those hours. There was something about the way he moved through the vineyard, his gestures unhurried, that made her feel like she was part of a timeless ritual, as ancient as the land itself. On one such evening, the sky was brushed with the soft glow of dusk, the air thick with the scent of wildflowers that bloomed along the edges of the vineyard. Cecilia slipped through the familiar path, her heart fluttering with a quiet excitement. She reached her usual spot beneath the olive trees and paused, her gaze searching for the dark silhouette she had grown accustomed to. But this time, something was different. The vineyard lay empty, its rows stretching out in serene stillness. Cecilia's brow furrowed, a twinge of disappointment tightening in her chest. She lingered for a moment, scanning the landscape for any sign of movement, but the only sound was the rustling of the leaves and the distant murmur of the wind as it whispered through the valley. After a while, she took a tentative step forward, curiosity driving her feet along the edge of the vineyard. Without Luca's presence, the place felt different, quieter, as though it were waiting for her to take a closer look. She moved carefully, her fingers brushing the leaves of the grapevines as she walked deeper into the rows. The vines seemed to welcome her, their tendrils stretching out as if inviting her into their world, where the air was thick with the promise of sun-ripened fruit. Cecilia wandered through the vineyard, marveling at the way the light shifted between the leaves, casting intricate patterns across the ground. She found herself drawn further along a narrow path, deeper than she had ever ventured before. It was as if the vineyard itself was revealing a hidden corner, guiding her to a place that had remained secret until now. Eventually, she stumbled upon a secluded section of the vineyard, a small clearing where the vines grew wild and untamed. Unlike the neatly pruned rows she had seen Luca care for, these vines seemed to have escaped the constraints of cultivation, twisting freely over the ancient stone walls that bordered the space. A soft carpet of wildflowers had taken root between the vines, their vibrant petals mingling with the deep green of the leaves. The air here was richer, sweeter, carrying the earthy scent of the grapes that hung heavily from the tangled vines. Cecilia stopped at the edge of this hidden vineyard, feeling a sense of awe at the discovery. It was as if she had stumbled upon a secret garden, a place that had been untouched by time. She let her fingers drift over a cluster of grapes, their skins warm and smooth beneath her touch, and she wondered how many summers had passed since these vines had been left to grow wild. She knelt among the wildflowers, feeling the cool earth beneath her palms, and allowed herself to become lost in the moment. Above her, the sky deepened into shades of rose and lavender, the last light of day slipping behind the hills. A soft breeze rustled through the vines, creating a melody that seemed to echo her own heartbeat. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly present, her thoughts unburdened by the demands of her life back in the city. She imagined what it would be like to stay here forever, to trade the constant rush of New York for the slow, languid pace of this place, to wake each morning to the sight of the sun rising over the vineyard, to spend her days tending to the earth, and to fall asleep to the song of the crickets. It was a life she had never considered before, but now, sitting among the vines in this hidden corner of Tuscany, it seemed as tangible as the soil beneath her fingers. As she sat there, she noticed a small, weathered book tucked into a crevice in the stone wall. Its cover was worn, faded by the sun and rain, but curiosity prompted her to reach for it. She turned the brittle pages carefully, revealing notes written in an elegant, looping script. The handwriting was in Italian, and though Cecilia's grasp of the language was limited, she could make out enough to understand that it was a journal of sorts, a record of the vineyard's history. The entry spoke of seasons long past, of harvests and celebrations, of summers that seemed endless. Cecilia's mind conjured images of those who had tended to these vines before, their hands guiding the growth of each branch, their voices mingling with the breeze that whispered through the leaves. She imagined Luca's ancestors walking these same paths, their lives intertwined with the rhythm of the land. The realization filled her with a sense of connection, as if she had been allowed a glimpse into a lineage that stretched back through the years. She closed the book gently, returning it to its resting place within the stones, and rose to her feet. A shadow had fallen over the hidden vineyard, the night creeping in from the edges of the hills. Reluctantly, Cecilia began to make her way back through the rows, retracing her steps toward the olive grove. The path seemed longer now, each step carrying with it the weight of the secrets she had uncovered. As she emerged from the vineyard, the farmhouse came into view, its windows glowing softly in the evening light. She felt a sense of longing, a quiet ache that settled in her chest. It was a feeling she couldn't quite name, but she knew it had something to do with the vineyard, with the man she had watched from a distance, and with the possibility that had begun to take root in her heart. Before heading back to the farmhouse, Cecilia paused for one last look at the vineyard, now veiled in the shadows of twilight. She wondered if she would see Luca again, if their paths would cross in the days to come. But for now, she carried the memory of the hidden vineyard with her, a secret shared between her and the land. Back at the farmhouse, she prepared a simple dinner, her thoughts lingering on the evening's discovery. She ate alone on the terrace, the night air cool against her skin, and gazed out over the darkened valley. Stars began to appear above, one by one, their light reflecting in the glass of wine she held in her hand. As she sipped the rich, earthy red, she imagined the grapes it had come from, the same ones that now grew wild in the hidden vineyard. She savored the taste, letting it linger on her tongue, as if she could absorb a piece of this place with every sip. Cecilia sat there long into the night, watching as the moon rose above the hills, casting a silvery glow over the land. The stillness enveloped her, filling the spaces where words would have been, had there been anyone to share them with. She thought of Luca and of the unspoken connection that had formed between them, born in the quiet moments between the vines. She wondered what stories he carried, what dreams he held close to his heart as he worked the land. As the moon climbed higher, Cecilia finally retired to her room, slipping into bed with the scent of the vineyard still clinging to her clothes. She closed her eyes, her mind filled with images of wildflowers, tangled vines, and a hidden corner of Tuscany that she had claimed as her own. And somewhere in the darkness, she felt the first stirrings of hope. Hope that this summer might bring more than just an escape, but perhaps a new beginning, woven from the soil of a place that had already begun to feel like home. Chapter 4. Among the Cypress Trees. Days folded into each other, as Cecilia fell deeper into the rhythm of Tuscan life. Each morning brought the same ritual. The first rays of sun streaming through her window, the comforting bitterness of her morning espresso, and the scent of wild herbs that drifted on the breeze as she walked through the garden. She had grown accustomed to the solitude, but her thoughts often wandered back to the hidden vineyard, to the tangled vines that had captivated her and the figure that had become an unexpected part of her days. Cecilia continued to return to the vineyard each evening, though she did not always find Luca among the rows. Sometimes, the vineyard stood empty, with only the whisper of the wind through the grapevines to keep her company. Yet she remained drawn to the place, tracing her fingers along the leaves and feeling the pulse of the land beneath her feet. She found herself visiting the wild, secluded corner more frequently, where she could sit among the unruly vines and let the day melt away around her. It had become a sanctuary, a place where she could escape the weight of her thoughts and lose herself in the stories the earth had to tell. One late afternoon, the air felt different, thicker, as though it held a secret that had yet to be revealed. The sky was cloudless, its blue deepening to an almost violet hue as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Cecilia walked with a sense of purpose, following the now familiar path through the olive trees and along the edge of the vineyard. She arrived at the hidden corner, her breath catching as she took in the scene that awaited her. Luca was there, standing among the wild vines, his back turned toward her. He moved slowly, with the same quiet grace she had come to associate with him, his hands working gently to guide a wayward vine back into place. He seemed at ease here, in this forgotten part of the vineyard, as though he, too, had found something special within its wildness. Cecilia hesitated at the edge of the clearing, caught between the desire to watch and the urge to step closer, to make herself known. She remained in the shadows, observing the way he navigated the tangled growth, noting the way the fading light painted him in shades of amber and gold. For the first time, she felt a pang of envy for the vines, for the way they were held in his hands, tended with such care. She wondered what it would be like to be seen like that, to be known, understood without the need for words. Time seemed to slow as she watched, the sun inching lower and casting long shadows across the vineyard. Luca continued his work, unaware of her presence, or perhaps simply choosing not to acknowledge it. He moved with an intimacy toward the land that Cecilia could only marvel at, as though every leaf and tendril held a story he could read. She sensed that this place held a deeper meaning for him, one that she could only glimpse from the outside. As the sun dipped below the hills, a soft glow settled over the valley, turning the leaves of the vines into a sea of shimmering gold. Cecilia could feel the air cooling, the night creeping in from the edges of the landscape. She knew she should turn back, return to the warmth of the farmhouse, but something held her in place. It was a strange feeling, part curiosity, part yearning, as if this hidden corner of the vineyard had become a doorway to another world, one where the rules of her life no longer applied. Cecilia took a small step forward, the dry earth crunching softly beneath her feet. Luca paused, lifting his head as if he had sensed her presence. He turned slightly, just enough for her to see the outline of his face, softened by the twilight. There was no surprise in his expression, only a quiet acknowledgement, as though he had known she would be there all along. They stood like that for a long moment, separated by the distance between the vines, the silence stretching between them like a thread. Then, as if deciding to leave the moment untouched, Luca turned back to the vine in his hands, continuing his work. Cecilia lingered for a moment longer, feeling a strange sense of understanding settle between them, even though no words had been exchanged. She retreated to the edge of the grove, her heart beating faster than she could explain, and watched as he finished his task, the sun casting the last of its light over his form before sinking into the hills. With night fully descending, Luca gathered his tools and began to make his way down the path, disappearing into the darkness toward the distant farmhouse that she had glimpsed on earlier nights. Cecilia waited until she could no longer see him before she began her own walk back, retracing her steps through the olive trees and feeling the coolness of the evening air settle into her bones. The shadows grew thicker around her, but she felt a strange warmth blooming within her, as though the hidden vineyard had offered her a gift she had yet to understand. Back at her farmhouse, Cecilia found herself restless, unable to settle into the familiar quiet of her room. She stood at the window, staring out into the night, her mind playing over the image of Luca in the vineyard, his silhouette framed by the golden light of dusk. She knew so little about him, only the outline of a story that she could barely piece together. Yet she felt a pull toward him, a desire to understand the secrets he carried, just as she had uncovered the secrets hidden among the wild vines. The next day dawned with a soft mist hanging over the valley, the air cool and damp against Cecilia's skin as she ventured out for her morning walk. She wandered through the olive grove, her thoughts turning over the memory of the previous evening like a stone in her hand. The mist clung to the leaves, transforming the landscape into a world of blurred edges, where reality and dreams seemed to merge. She found herself drawn to the hidden vineyard once more, though this time she arrived to find it empty, the vines swathed in a veil of morning dew. Cecilia spent the day exploring further afield, visiting a small market in the nearby village where locals sold jars of honey and baskets of fresh figs. She wandered among the stalls, savoring the simplicity of the scene. The way life seemed to unfold in gentle waves rather than the relentless pace she had known. Yet even as she immersed herself in the warmth of the village, her thoughts remained tied to the vineyard, to the quiet presence that had become an anchor in this unfamiliar place. That evening, she returned to the path through the olive grove, her heart quickening as she approached the vineyard's edge. She hoped she might see him again, even if only from a distance. But as she reached the hidden corner, she found it empty once more, the wild vines swaying gently in the evening breeze. A pang of disappointment settled in her chest, though she couldn't quite understand why. She moved through the clearing, her footsteps soft against the earth, and found herself kneeling beside the old stone wall where the weathered journal lay hidden. She opened it again, turning the fragile pages, her fingers tracing the faded ink. The entries spoke of love and loss, of the changing seasons and the dreams that had been woven into the land. She wondered if Luca knew about the journal, if he had read the stories contained within its pages. It seemed impossible to imagine that he would not be aware of this hidden piece of the vineyard's history, just as he seemed to know every twist and turn of the land. Cecilia closed the book gently, tucking it back into its resting place among the stones. She rose and walked through the vineyard, allowing herself to wander deeper into the rows until she reached a point where the landscape opened up, revealing a view that stretched all the way to the distant hills. The sky above burned with the colors of sunset, and for a moment, she felt as though she was standing on the edge of the world, with nothing but the vines and the sky and the wind to keep her company. She stayed there until the light faded, until the shadows stretched long across the earth and the first stars began to prick the sky. When she finally turned back, she felt a sense of resolution settle over her, a quiet determination to continue returning to this place, no matter what she found. She had come to Italy seeking an escape, but she was beginning to realize that what she truly sought was a connection to the land, to the history that lay buried within it, and perhaps to the man who moved through the vineyard like a ghost from another time. That night, she lay awake in her bed, listening to the distant rustle of leaves outside her window. The image of the wild vineyard stayed with her, a tangle of possibilities that stirred her thoughts long into the night. She closed her eyes and imagined what it might be like to walk through the rows with Luca beside her, to share in the secrets that the vineyard held. It was a fragile hope, one she barely dared to acknowledge, but it carried her into sleep with the gentle promise of what the days ahead might bring. Chapter 5. Whispers of the Sea Breeze. The summer days slipped past like water through Cecilia's fingers, each one marked by the steady rhythm of her walks, the stillness of the vineyard, and the lingering traces of Luca's presence. She settled into a quiet routine, drawn back each evening to the secluded corner of the vineyard where the vines grew untamed. Yet the anticipation of seeing him again, of finding him among the rows, moving with the same fluid grace that had first captured her attention, never left her. It became a thread running through her thoughts, pulling her back to the same place again and again. Cecilia's connection to the land deepened with each visit. She began to understand the subtle shifts in the air that signaled the onset of dusk, the way the shadows lengthened as the sun dipped toward the horizon, and the patterns of the breeze that moved through the vines. She spent her mornings exploring the hills and valleys beyond the vineyard, tracing paths through cypress-lined roads and discovering hidden groves of fig trees. Yet it was the vineyard that called her back, its wildness a reminder that some things resisted taming. One afternoon, Cecilia ventured deeper into the vineyard than she had before, following a path that wound through the rows like a river. The air was heavy with the scent of ripening grapes, and the sun beat down relentlessly, casting sharp lines of shadow across the earth. She paused frequently, reaching out to touch the leaves, to run her fingers over the clusters of fruit that hung heavy on the vines. She marveled at the richness of the colors, at the way each grape seemed to hold the promise of the earth itself. As she reached a clearing near the vineyard's edge, she stumbled upon a small, ancient-looking fountain, its stone edges weathered by time and the elements. A thin trickle of water still flowed from the mouth of a carved cherub, creating ripples that danced across the surface of the basin. Cecilia knelt beside the fountain, dipping her hands into the cool water, feeling the contrast against her sun-warmed skin. She closed her eyes, letting the sensation ground her, as if the vineyard itself was offering her a moment of respite. When she opened her eyes, she noticed something that had been hidden behind a curtain of ivy, a stone bench almost swallowed by the overgrowth. She moved closer, brushing away the vines that clung to its surface, revealing intricate carvings that hinted at a long-forgotten past. Cecilia sat down, letting the rough texture of the stone press against her back, and took in the view before her. The vineyard stretched out below, a sea of green that rolled down into the valley, with the terracotta roofs of the village just visible in the distance. She wondered how many people had sat on this bench before her, watching the same sun dip below the hills, feeling the same breeze that carried whispers of stories from the past. Her thoughts drifted to Luca, to the quiet understanding that had passed between them in those brief moments among the vines. She could not help but feel that the vineyard had woven them together, just as the roots of the vines twisted and intertwined beneath the soil. That evening, she returned to the hidden corner once more, her steps lighter, her heart caught in a strange flutter. She found the place empty again, the shadows of the vines stretching out like dark tendrils across the earth. Yet there was a sense of presence lingering in the air, as if the vineyard itself held a memory of him. Cecilia moved through the rows, letting the rustle of the leaves guide her, until she reached the stone wall where she had discovered the old journal. She retrieved the journal from its hiding place, feeling the coolness of the stones beneath her fingers, and settled onto the ground beside the wall. She turned the pages slowly, savoring each entry as though she were unearthing a secret buried long ago. The stories within spoke of love and loss, of the delicate balance between nature and the human heart. They described a time when the vineyard had been a place of gatherings and celebrations, when lovers had stolen moments beneath the moonlight and whispered their dreams into the night air. Cecilia closed the journal, cradling it in her lap as she watched the sky deepen from gold to violet. The air grew cooler, the first hints of evening settling over the land. She thought of Luca, of the way he seemed to carry the weight of the vineyard in his silence, as though he, too, was bound to its history. She wondered if he ever sat here, on the stone bench by the fountain, contemplating the same mysteries that filled her mind. As darkness fell, Cecilia rose, tucking the journal back into its place among the stones. She lingered for a moment, listening to the sounds of the vineyard, the murmur of the wind through the leaves, the distant song of a night bird. She felt a sense of calm settle over her, as though the land had offered her a small piece of its ancient wisdom. Yet beneath that calm lay a restlessness, a yearning she could not name, one that pushed her to return to this place again and again. Over the next few days, Cecilia made the clearing by the fountain her own. She brought a small sketchbook with her, filling its pages with drawings of the vines, of the stone cherub that watched over the fountain, and of the distant hills that rolled toward the horizon. She spent hours beneath the dappled light of the vineyard, letting her thoughts drift with the breeze. She imagined the vineyard in different times, in different seasons, as it might have looked when the entries in the journal were freshly written. Yet as much as she tried to lose herself in the past, her thoughts kept returning to the present, to the quiet presence that had woven itself into the fabric of her days. She began to wonder what Luca did when he wasn't tending to the vines, where he went when the shadows grew long and the valley fell into silence. She wondered if he ever thought of her, if he felt the same pull that had brought her to this place, time and time again. One evening, as Cecilia lingered by the fountain, she caught sight of a small gift left on the stone bench, a single bunch of grapes, their deep purple skin glistening in the last light of the day. She hesitated, glancing around the clearing, half expecting to see Luca stepping out from the shadows. But the vineyard remained still, its secrets hidden behind the rustle of the leaves. She picked up the grapes, feeling the weight of them in her hand, and smiled, a small, fleeting expression that she allowed to bloom in the solitude. She took the gift back with her to the farmhouse, placing it on the windowsill where it caught the light of the setting sun. The next morning, she returned to the clearing, leaving a small drawing she had made of the fountain in its place. It became a quiet exchange between them, a ritual without words that wove them closer to the land and to each other. Each day, Cecilia would find some new token, a polished stone, a sprig of wild rosemary, or a carefully tied bundle of dried lavender. In return, she left her sketches, small traces of her presence in a place that had become more familiar than anywhere she had known. Through these small gestures, Cecilia felt a connection growing between them, something fragile yet persistent, like the first green shoots that break through the soil in spring. She began to understand that there was a language between them that went beyond words, one that unfolded slowly in the spaces between their encounters. It was a language of touch and gesture, of the land and the things it gave up to those who listened closely enough. As the summer days grew longer, Cecilia found herself feeling lighter, as though the weight of her past had begun to lift. The vineyard had become a place where she could breathe deeply, where the world seemed to unfold at a slower pace, allowing her to savor each moment. And though she still did not know what the future held, she felt a sense of promise in the air, a sense that the vineyard, with all its secrets and wildness, had more to reveal. The nights brought dreams filled with vines and starlight, with glimpses of Luca moving through the vineyard, his silhouette blending with the shadows. She would wake with a sense of anticipation, eager to see what the day might bring, what new story the land would share. The vineyard had become a part of her, as much as she had become a part of it, and she could not imagine leaving it behind. In this quiet dance of gestures and offerings, Cecilia felt the first stirrings of hope, a hope that had nothing to do with escape or running away. It was a hope rooted in the soil of the vineyard, in the slow, steady growth of something that had been hidden for too long. And as the summer sun painted the hills in shades of gold, she knew that whatever came next, she would meet it with an open heart, ready to embrace the possibilities that lay just beyond the horizon. Chapter 6: A Secret Among Ruins. The rhythm of Cecilia's days at the vineyard had become as predictable as the sun's path across the sky. Yet each moment held the promise of discovery. Mornings began with mist rolling over the hills, shrouding the rows of vines in a pale veil that made the world seem timeless. She would set out early, her sketchbook tucked beneath her arm, retracing her steps to the secluded clearing near the fountain. There, in the half-light, She would sit on the stone bench, feeling the cool air settle on her skin as she watched the vineyard slowly awaken. The summer heat that had once felt oppressive softened with each passing week, giving way to a gentler warmth that lingered like a lover's touch. The vines, too, seemed to respond to the change, their leaves taking on a richer hue as the grapes swelled with juice. Cecilia had learned to anticipate these shifts, to appreciate the slow, steady transformation of the land. She found herself attuned to the subtle changes in the vineyard's rhythm, each day revealing new colors, new textures that spoke to her in the quiet language of nature. Yet as familiar as the vineyard had become, the sense of mystery that had first drawn her to it remained. It was a feeling that settled into her bones, like the memory of a dream she could never fully grasp. Luca's silent presence lingered in the corners of her mind, woven into the very fabric of the vineyard, as elusive as the shadows that played among the vines. She often imagined him moving through the rows, his hands grazing the leaves as he walked, his gaze focused on some distant horizon she could not see. Cecilia found herself drawn back to the hidden corner by the stone wall where she had discovered the old journal. It had become a place of quiet reflection, a sanctuary within the vineyard's embrace. She would spend hours there, tracing her fingers over the weathered pages of the journal, letting its stories unfold in her imagination. The entries spoke of a time when the vineyard had been more than just a patch of land. It had been a gathering place, a place where people came together to celebrate the harvest, to dance beneath the stars, and to share the fruits of their labor. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the vineyard, Cecilia felt a sudden urge to explore further, to see if the land might offer up more of its secrets. She followed a narrow path that wound through the vineyard, leading her to an old barn that stood at the edge of the property. The barn's wooden beams were weathered and cracked, its roof sagging under the weight of time. Yet there was a charm to its decay, a sense that it held memories too precious to be forgotten. Cecilia pushed open the barn's heavy door, letting the sunlight spill inside. Dust motes danced in the beams of light, swirling through the air like golden embers. The space inside was cluttered with remnants of the past, rusted tools, broken barrels, and crates stacked haphazardly against the walls. She moved slowly, her footsteps echoing off the worn wooden floor, as she explored the barn's forgotten corners. In the back, she found a stack of old photographs, their edges curled with age. She knelt down, carefully lifting one from the pile. The image was faded, but she could make out a group of people standing among the vines, their faces turned toward the camera in smiles that spoke of a shared joy. They were celebrating a harvest, holding glasses of wine high in a toast to the season's bounty. Among them, she recognized the same stone fountain she had come to love, its cherub still pouring water into the basin. As she sifted through the photographs, she found more images of the vineyard in different seasons. Rows of bare vines dusted with snow, fields ablaze with wildflowers, and sunsets that bathed the hills in hues of crimson and gold. Each photograph felt like a window into another world, a world that existed long before she had set foot on this land. Yet there was something strangely familiar in each image, as though the vineyard's spirit had remained unchanged, even as time flowed on around it. Cecilia carefully gathered the photographs into a neat stack and tucked them into her sketchbook. She left the barn with a sense of connection that ran deeper than words, as if she had uncovered a thread that linked her to those who had come before. She walked back to the clearing by the fountain, her mind buzzing with the stories the images might hold. She wondered who had taken those photographs, and whether they had felt the same pull toward the vineyard's mysteries that she did. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Cecilia spread the photographs out across the stone bench, letting the fading light illuminate each one. She studied the faces of the people in the images, their expressions frozen in time, and found herself imagining their lives. She wondered if they, too, had felt the vineyard's pull, if they had come to this place in search of something they could not name. She could almost hear the distant echoes of their laughter, carried on the evening breeze that rustled through the vines. As the light faded, Cecilia gathered the photographs into a small bundle, tying them with a piece of twine she had found in the barn. She placed the bundle on the bench, leaving it there as a silent offering to the past. It felt like a gesture of gratitude, a way of acknowledging the stories that had come before, even as she walked her own path through the vineyard's tangled history. In the days that followed, Cecilia continued her quiet ritual of exchanging tokens with Luca. The bundle of photographs remained untouched on the bench, but in its place, she found a delicate sprig of grapevine, its tendrils still curling as if reaching for the sun. She traced the pattern of the vine with her fingers, feeling the smoothness of the leaves and the rough texture of the bark. It felt like a message, a reminder that the vineyard's stories were still unfolding, that there was more to discover if she had the patience to listen. Cecilia began to notice more details in the land around her. The way the light shifted as the days grew shorter, the deepening colors of the leaves as they edged toward autumn, and the gentle hum of life that thrummed beneath the surface of the soil. She spent more time sketching in her notebook, capturing the vineyard's changing moods, the way the shadows played across the rows, and the soft glow of twilight that settled over the hills. One late afternoon, as she sketched the stone cherub of the fountain, she noticed a small wooden box nestled beneath the vines, half hidden by a cluster of leaves. She reached for it, feeling the rough grain of the wood beneath her fingers as she lifted it into her lap. The box was simple, with a brass clasp that had tarnished over time. She opened it carefully, revealing a collection of dried flowers pressed between sheets of yellowed paper. The flowers were delicate, their petals faded to shades of cream and lavender, yet they held a faint scent of the vineyard's past. Cecilia turned the pages slowly, letting each flower unfold like a memory preserved between the leaves. She imagined the hands that had placed them there, pressing them flat with care, and wondered if they, too, had found solace in the vineyard's quiet beauty. As she reached the last page, she found a small handwritten note tucked between the layers of paper. The ink had bled with age, but she could still make out the words. A simple poem that spoke of the vineyard cycles, of the way the land gave and took in equal measure, of the love that could be found in the turning of the seasons. Cecilia read the poem again and again, letting the rhythm of the words sink into her bones until it felt like a part of her own story. That night, she left the box of pressed flowers beside the fountain, with a single drawing of the vineyard's rolling hills slipped beneath the lid. She hoped Luca would find it, that he might understand the silent message she had tried to convey through her sketches and her presence in the land. It was a gesture that felt both intimate and anonymous, a way of reaching out to the past while anchoring herself in the present. As the summer's warmth slowly gave way to the cool breath of autumn, Cecilia felt a shift within herself, a sense of belonging that she had not known in years. The vineyard, with its secrets and its silences, had become her home in a way that no place ever had before. And though she still did not know where the future would take her, she felt a quiet certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, bound to the land and to the stories that whispered through the leaves. With each passing day, she found herself growing more comfortable with the uncertainty, with the gaps in the vineyard's history that she might never fill. She had come to understand that some stories were meant to remain unfinished, that the beauty of the vineyard lay in its ability to hold both past and present in a delicate balance. And in that space between what was known and what remained hidden, she found the beginnings of a new kind of peace, one that allowed her to linger in the moments of stillness without needing to rush toward an end. As the sun set on another day, painting the vineyard in shades of rose and gold, Cecilia watched the shadows lengthen across the land, knowing that the vineyard still held its secrets close. Yet she felt a quiet joy in being a part of its story, in knowing that she, too, had left her mark among the vines. And as the evening breeze carried the scent of grapes ripening on the vine, she closed her eyes, letting the vineyard's song fill the spaces between her breaths, content to let the story unfold in its own time. Chapter 7. Rainfall in Rome. The first hints of autumn had begun to weave their way through the vineyard, casting a golden veil over the landscape. Cecilia rose with the morning light, drawn outside by the cool air that carried the promise of change. The hills shimmered beneath a sky that seemed to stretch on forever, a deep, cloudless blue that mirrored the sea in the distance. In the soft warmth of the early sun, she wandered through the rows of vines, savoring the way the light filtered through the canopy, painting dappled patterns on the earth. Her steps eventually led her to the clearing by the stone fountain, where the traces of summer lingered in the thick, heady scent of ripening grapes. The fountain, with its gentle, ever-present trickle of water, felt like a heartbeat that connected her to the land. Cecilia paused by its edge, dipping her fingers into the cool water, letting it flow over her skin in delicate streams. It felt like a ritual, a moment of communion with the place that had come to hold so much meaning for her. She carried with her the wooden box of pressed flowers she had found days earlier. Inside it, she had added more sketches, drawings of the vineyard as it shifted through the days, of the sun rising over the hills, of the gnarled vines bending under the weight of their harvest. The box had become a symbol of the connection she felt, a way to express what she could not put into words. Today, she had decided to leave it by the fountain again, hoping that Luca might discover it during one of his wanderings. As she set the box down beside the stone bench, a movement in the distance caught her eye. She looked up to see a figure moving through the rows of vines, heading toward the edge of the vineyard where the hills sloped gently toward the sea. Even at this distance, she knew it was Luca. He moved with a quiet grace, his steps sure and steady, as if the vineyard itself guided him. Cecilia felt a sudden urge to follow, as though the invisible thread that connected them was pulling her toward him. She trailed behind, careful to keep her distance, not wanting to disturb the solitude that seemed to cloak him like a second skin. She watched as Luca made his way to a secluded part of the vineyard, where a lone olive tree stood sentinel against the sky. Its silvered leaves rustled in the breeze, casting shifting shadows across the ground. Luca paused beneath its branches, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the sea met the sky in a seamless line. Cecilia lingered at the edge of the clearing, hidden among the vines, her heart beating in time with the wind that whispered through the leaves. She watched as Luca reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a faded photograph, its edges worn smooth with age. He held it up to the light, letting the sun illuminate its surface, and for a moment, Cecilia could see the wistfulness in his expression, the way his eyes softened as he studied the image. She realized with a start that it was one of the photographs she had found in the barn, one that she had tucked into the box as a kind of offering. It was a picture of the vineyard from decades ago, showing a group of people gathered for the harvest, their faces bright with laughter. Cecilia felt a rush of warmth, a sense that she had reached him in some small way, that the stories of the past had bridged the distance between them. Luca lingered beneath the olive tree for a long time, the photograph held gently in his hands, as if he were absorbing the memories it contained. Cecilia watched him, feeling a strange mixture of longing and contentment, as though she were witnessing a moment that was not hers to share, yet could not look away. It was a feeling she had come to recognize, a sense that she was both a part of the vineyard's story and apart from it, a visitor who had stumbled upon a secret world. After a while, Luca slipped the photograph back into his pocket and turned to leave, his steps leading him back toward the heart of the vineyard. Cecilia waited until he had disappeared from view before stepping out from her hiding place, her feet carrying her to the olive tree where he had stood. She reached out to touch the rough bark of the tree, feeling the ancient grooves beneath her fingertips, as though she might absorb the memory of his presence through her touch. The wind picked up, rustling through the branches, and Cecilia closed her eyes, letting the breeze wrap around her. She felt a connection to this place, to Luca, to the stories held within the land, that was deeper than anything she had known before. It was as if the vineyard itself had become a part of her, its roots winding through her soul, binding her to its rhythms and its silences. She breathed in the scent of the earth, the salt of the distant sea, and felt a sense of belonging that settled into her bones. Later that evening, Cecilia returned to the villa with a heart that felt both lighter and heavier, as if she had uncovered a new layer of the vineyard's mysteries. She spent the twilight hours on the terrace, sketching the scene she had witnessed beneath the olive tree. Her hands moved quickly, capturing the play of light and shadow, the curve of Luca's silhouette as he stood against the sky, the way the photograph seemed to glow in the golden light. As the stars began to emerge one by one, Cecilia laid her sketchbook aside and wrapped herself in a blanket, gazing out over the vineyard's shadowed rows. The moon rose, casting a silver light over the land, turning the leaves to quicksilver and making the stone fountain glisten like glass. In the quiet of the night, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, a feeling that she was exactly where she needed to be. Yet even in the stillness, there was a sense of anticipation, a knowledge that the vineyard's story was still unfolding, that each day brought her closer to understanding its mysteries. She thought of Luca, of the photograph he had carried with such care, and wondered what memories it held for him. She wondered if he, too, felt the same pull toward the past, the same desire to uncover the stories that lay hidden beneath the surface. The days that followed unfolded with the same gentle rhythm, yet each moment felt charged with new meaning. Cecilia continued her quiet exchanges with Luca, leaving small drawings and sketches in the hidden corners of the vineyard, and sometimes finding new tokens in return. A bundle of wildflowers tied with twine, a smooth stone from the river, a sprig of rosemary that filled her sketchbook with its fragrance. It was a language without words, a dance of gestures that bound them together in a way that transcended the need for speech. One afternoon, as Cecilia walked through the rows of vines, she came across a bundle of herbs tied with a strand of pale blue ribbon. It was the same shade as the sky on the day they had first met, a color that seemed to carry the memory of that moment in its delicate hue. She tucked the bundle into her satchel, feeling a warmth bloom in her chest, a sense that she was walking a path that had been laid out long before she had arrived. In the evenings, she would sit by the fountain, sketching by the light of the setting sun, her thoughts drifting to Luca and the moments they had shared, however brief and unspoken. She found herself wondering what had drawn him to the vineyard, what memories tied him to this place. She imagined the stories he might carry within him, stories that echoed the ones she had discovered in the old journal, in the photographs, in the scent of the vineyard's soil. Cecilia knew that there were still secrets she had yet to uncover, that the vineyard held memories that would only reveal themselves in time. But as she sat beneath the stars, listening to the murmur of the leaves in the evening breeze, she felt a quiet assurance that the answers would come when she was ready to receive them. For now, it was enough to let the vineyard's whispers guide her, to follow the threads that wound through its history, weaving her own story into the fabric of the land. And so, she continued to walk the vineyard's paths each day, letting the rhythm of the seasons carry her forward, trusting in the gentle pull that had brought her here. She knew that Luca's presence was a part of that pull, a thread that ran through the vineyard's heart, connecting them in ways she could not yet understand. And as the days grew shorter and the light softened, she felt a growing certainty that the story they were writing together, in the quiet spaces between words, was one that would linger long after the last leaf had fallen. Chapter 8. Parting Clouds in Positano. The days of early autumn drifted by, carrying a crispness in the air that signaled the end of summer's warmth. Cecilia found herself waking earlier each morning, her mind filled with a restless energy that matched the vineyard's quiet transformation. The sun rose lower on the horizon now, casting long shadows across the hills, and the air grew cooler with each passing day. Yet the vineyard remained vibrant, its rows of vines heavy with ripened fruit, waiting for the final harvest. On this particular morning, Cecilia ventured into the heart of the vineyard, carrying her sketchbook and a small basket. She moved along the familiar path, her feet crunching on fallen leaves, the air thick with the scent of earth and fermenting grapes. As she walked, she marveled at how the vineyard had changed in such a short time. The vibrant green of summer had given way to deeper hues, the leaves turning shades of gold, amber, and crimson. The landscape felt like a painting coming to life, each vine and hill a brushstroke on nature's canvas. Her destination was a secluded spot near the edge of the vineyard, where a wild fig tree had grown beside a crumbling stone wall. Its branches stretched outward, offering fruit that had gone unnoticed amid the abundance of the season. Cecilia had discovered the tree during one of her earlier walks and had returned to it often, drawn by the way its gnarled limbs seemed to twist toward the sky, as if reaching for the sun. Today, she intended to gather some of the figs, a small gift she hoped might convey her gratitude to Luca in their ongoing, unspoken exchange. As she plucked the figs, their soft skins yielding easily to her touch, she felt the warmth of the sun on her back, a gentle reminder that summer's memory still lingered in the air. Her thoughts turned to Luca and the quiet companionship they had shared in these past weeks. They rarely crossed paths directly, but she had come to sense his presence in subtle ways. Footprints left in the soft earth, a freshly arranged pile of stones near the river, a row of neatly pruned vines that had not been there the day before. Cecilia filled her basket with figs and then settled beneath the tree, opening her sketchbook to capture the scene before her. Her pencil moved across the page, tracing the curves of the vine-covered wall, the graceful bend of the fig tree's branches. She worked quickly, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of shading and cross-hatching, allowing the vineyard's peace to seep into her bones. As she sketched, she found herself wondering about Luca's own connection to this place, about the stories he carried within him, and how much they might mirror her own. Hours slipped by as Cecilia drew, the sun climbing higher in the sky before beginning its slow descent toward the west. The shadows lengthened, turning the vineyard into a patchwork of light and shade, each row of vines casting dark stripes across the golden ground. When she finally looked up from her work, her fingers stained with charcoal, she noticed a figure moving along the path that wound through the hills. Her heart gave a sudden jolt of recognition. It was Luca, his silhouette unmistakable against the backdrop of fading sunlight. He walked with an easy, unhurried stride, his gaze sweeping over the vineyard as if he were memorizing every detail. He carried a wooden crate balanced on one shoulder, likely filled with the day's harvest, and Cecilia felt a pang of admiration for the quiet strength in his movements. She watched as he paused near the riverbank, setting down the crate and turning his attention to the water, where the current glimmered in the late afternoon light. Cecilia remained hidden beneath the fig tree, her breath catching as she observed him. There was something different about Luca today, a heaviness in his posture that she had not noticed before. He seemed to linger by the river longer than usual, as if he were lost in thought, his expression unreadable in the distance. Cecilia wished she could close the gap between them, to share whatever weighed on his mind, but she held herself back, respecting the space that had always defined their unspoken bond. Instead, she reached into her basket and pulled out a few of the figs, arranging them carefully on the sketchbook page where she had drawn the fig tree. She closed the book gently, cradling it in her hands as she rose from her place beneath the branches. With careful steps, She approached the riverbank, her heart fluttering in her chest with each stride. Luca's back was turned to her, his attention still fixed on the water, and she moved quietly, hoping to leave the sketchbook where he might find it later, a silent offering to bridge the distance between them. As she drew nearer, Cecilia could hear the sound of the river's flow, its soft murmur mingling with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. She set the sketchbook down on a smooth stone near the water's edge, arranging the figs beside it, their dark skins gleaming in the slanted light. She allowed herself a moment to gaze at Luca's silhouette, the way the sunlight caught in the waves of his hair, turning it to burnished gold. Then, with a sense of reluctance, she turned back toward the vineyard, slipping away before he could sense her presence. Cecilia retraced her steps through the rows of vines, her heart still racing from the nearness of the moment. She tried to focus on the fading beauty of the vineyard, the last burst of color in the leaves, the way the earth seemed to hold its breath as the season shifted. But her thoughts kept returning to Luca, to the way he had stood by the river with such stillness, as if he were listening for something only he could hear. She wondered what thoughts had occupied his mind, what memories the river might have stirred in him. The evening descended slowly, casting a deep blue over the landscape. The vineyard bathed in the silvery glow of twilight. Back at the villa, Cecilia settled on the terrace, her gaze sweeping over the darkening hills, where the first stars began to pierce the sky. The air had grown cool, carrying with it the scent of the sea and the distant promise of rain. She wrapped herself in a woolen shawl, her thoughts wandering back to the riverbank and the gift she had left behind. She imagined Luca discovering the sketchbook, the way he might pause to study the drawings, to trace the lines of the fig tree with the same care she had used to create them. Perhaps he would understand what she had meant to convey. Her gratitude, her longing, her sense of connection to this place and to him. And perhaps, in his own way, he would respond, as he always did, with a gesture that spoke more than any words ever could. As the night deepened, Cecilia felt a quiet sense of fulfillment settle over her, a feeling that she had taken a step closer to unraveling the mystery of Luca's heart. She knew that the vineyard held many secrets, and that time moved differently here, weaving past and present together in a way that defied simple understanding. But she also knew that her story with Luca was a part of that tapestry, a thread that wound through the vines and the river and the hills, binding them together in ways she could not yet see. The stars above glittered with a cold, distant light, and Cecilia closed her eyes, listening to the symphony of the night. The chirp of crickets in the underbrush, the sigh of wind through the olive trees, the faint hum of the ocean far beyond the hills. She let these sounds fill her, carrying her into a dreamlike state, where the vineyard's rhythms and her own heartbeat became one. And somewhere in that half-waking space, she sensed that Luca was near, as if his presence lingered in the air between the vines, a shadow that moved alongside her even when they were apart. In the days that followed, she searched for signs that he had found the sketchbook, new patterns in the stones near the river, a freshly pruned section of vines, a bundle of herbs tied with the same pale blue ribbon. And though she found no clear answer, there was a feeling that lingered in the air, a quiet warmth that seemed to settle into the landscape, as though the vineyard itself held their secret exchange in its ancient roots. Cecilia continued her walks, her sketches, her small offerings to the land and to the story she had become a part of. And each time she reached the riverbank, she felt the faint echo of that afternoon beneath the fig tree, the knowledge that Luca had stood there too, that they had shared a moment without ever needing to speak. It was enough to keep her moving forward, to trust that the answers would come when the time was right. And so, she let herself be carried by the rhythms of the vineyard, the ebb and flow of the seasons, the pull of the unseen thread that bound her to this place and to Luca. She knew that the days ahead would bring change, as they always did, but she faced them with a heart that felt lighter than it had in years. For in the shadows and sunlight of the vineyard, she had found something she had not known she was seeking, a sense of belonging, a connection that ran deeper than words. And whatever the future held, she knew she would face it with a spirit that had been touched by the quiet beauty of this land and the unspoken bond she shared with Luca. Chapter 9, Lost and Found in Venice. Autumn had settled firmly over the vineyard, draping the hills in a misty, golden veil each morning before giving way to the soft, slanted sunlight of the afternoon. The air held a crispness now, the days cooler and the nights longer, as the season's final harvest approached. The grapes had grown plump on the vines, their dark skins rich with the sugars of a season well lived. The workers moved through the vineyard with an urgency that mirrored the rhythm of the land itself, knowing that each cluster gathered marked the culmination of months of labor and care. Cecilia felt the weight of this change, the vineyard's transformation echoing her own shifting emotions. Her days had become a series of familiar routines. Her morning walks among the rows, afternoons spent at her easel, evenings on the terrace watching the sunset dissolve into twilight. Yet beneath this surface of quiet predictability, there was an undercurrent of anticipation, a sense that something unspoken hovered in the space between each heartbeat. Her thoughts often drifted back to the sketchbook she had left for Luca, wondering if he had understood its meaning, if he had taken from it what she had hoped to convey. She noticed small changes, signs of a presence that hinted at his response, but he remained elusive, a shadow woven into the fabric of her days. Sometimes she would catch sight of him on the far edge of the vineyard, his form a silhouette against the orange glow of evening, and a warmth would rise within her, a feeling she could not fully name. One morning, as the mist clung stubbornly to the hills, Cecilia found herself drawn to a secluded corner of the vineyard where the vines gave way to a grove of olive trees. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the ground beneath her feet was soft, giving way with each step. She carried with her a basket of freshly picked pomegranates, their skins a deep crimson, and her mind was filled with the memory of Luca's hands as they worked, steady and sure, among the vines. She reached the grove and settled beneath the broad branches of an ancient olive tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted with age. Here, the light filtered through the leaves in pale, dappled patches, creating a pattern that danced across the ground. She placed the basket beside her, her fingers brushing over the smooth skins of the pomegranates, and took a deep breath, letting the stillness of the grove envelop her. Cecilia opened her sketchbook and began to draw, the pencil gliding over the page with a surety that matched the season's urgency. She sketched the olive tree's intricate network of roots, the way they knotted through the earth, intertwining with the roots of the vines nearby. Her mind wandered to Luca, to the secrets that seemed to lie beneath his quiet demeanor, the history that lingered in the depths of his gaze. She wondered about the stories he had lived before he came to this place, about the losses and joys that had shaped the man he had become. Hours slipped by in the grove, the sun rising higher until it burned away the last of the morning mist. Cecilia's fingers ached from the pressure of her pencil, but she continued, lost in the act of creation, letting her thoughts flow onto the page like the river that wound through the vineyard. She drew not only the olive tree but the vineyard itself, capturing the gentle slope of the hills, the river's silver ribbon, and the distant silhouette of the villa where she and Luca had carved out their separate yet intertwined lives. When she finally paused to rest, her hands stained with graphite and the air cool against her skin, she became aware of a presence nearby. Her breath caught, and she turned, expecting to see Luca's familiar figure emerging from between the trees. But there was no one. Only the shadows of the grove, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of a bird high above. And yet, Cecilia felt the weight of another's gaze, a subtle awareness that sent a shiver down her spine. She stood and gathered her belongings, leaving behind a few of the pomegranates as she often did, a gesture of offering to the place that had become her sanctuary. As she made her way back through the vineyard, the feeling of being watched lingered, a sensation that was not entirely unwelcome. She imagined Luca's presence trailing behind her, his footsteps falling softly on the path she had worn through the rows of vines. Later that afternoon, as Cecilia returned to the villa, she noticed a change in the air. The workers had paused in their tasks, their voices hushed, eyes turned toward the sky, where dark clouds gathered on the horizon. A storm was coming, the kind that rolled in from the sea and swept over the hills with a fierce, cleansing energy. She felt the electricity in the air, the vineyard bracing itself for the deluge, and she hurried inside, closing the shutters against the first drops of rain that spattered against the windows. The storm broke with sudden violence, rain lashing against the villa's stone walls, wind howling through the cracks in the wood. Cecilia watched from her window, captivated by the raw power of nature. The way the vineyard seemed to bend and sway beneath the onslaught, yet remained steadfast. She thought of Luca, wondering where he had sought shelter, if he was watching the storm from a hidden corner of the vineyard, as she was. As the storm raged on, Cecilia moved through the villa's quiet rooms, her thoughts drifting like the rain that coursed down the glass. She made her way to the small studio where she kept her finished sketches and paintings, drawn there by a sense of restlessness that she could not quite shake. She lit a candle and settled in the dim light, thumbing through the pages of her sketchbook, lingering over the drawings she had made since arriving in this place. Each line, each shadow, held a memory of her time here, a reflection of the quiet bond that had grown between her and Luca. Outside, the storm began to ease, the rain tapering to a steady patter, the wind softening to a whisper. Cecilia returned to the window, peering out into the darkness that enveloped the vineyard. The clouds had thinned, revealing patches of sky where the stars shone through, their light fragmented and softened by the lingering mist. She strained her eyes, searching for movement among the shadows, hoping to catch a glimpse of Luca's silhouette moving through the rain-soaked vines. And then, as if answering her silent wish, she saw him. A dark figure standing near the olive grove, his form barely discernible in the moonlight that filtered through the clouds. He was looking toward the villa, his stance still, as if he too were searching for a sign. The sight sent a jolt through Cecilia's chest, a mixture of relief and longing that left her breathless. For a moment, they remained like this, separated by distance, yet connected by the thread that had wound tighter with each passing day. She could not see his face, but she imagined the expression he wore, the questions that might linger in his eyes, the unspoken thoughts that hovered between them. She pressed a hand to the glass, feeling the cold seep through her skin, wishing she could bridge the space between them. Then, slowly, Luca turned away, disappearing into the darkness, his silhouette swallowed by the shadows of the grove. Cecilia watched until she could no longer make out his shape, until the night closed in around him and the only sound was the rain's soft murmur. She stayed by the window long after he had gone, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their time together in the vineyard was drawing to a close, that the season of harvest would soon give way to the stillness of winter. Yet as she stood there, she felt a flicker of hope take root in her chest, small but persistent. It was the same hope she had felt on the morning she had left the sketchbook beneath the fig tree, a belief that the connection she and Luca had forged would not be easily undone by time or distance. The storm had passed, leaving the vineyard refreshed, its secrets washed clean by the rain, and Cecilia allowed herself to believe that there might still be a chance for her and Luca to find a way forward, together. She blew out the candle and moved through the darkened villa, listening to the rain's steady rhythm on the roof, a lullaby that eased her thoughts into stillness. As she drifted into sleep, She held onto the image of Luca standing beneath the olive tree, the sense that even in the silence and shadows, they were not truly alone. And in the quiet of the vineyard, beneath the sheltering arms of the trees and the open sky, she sensed that their story was not yet finished, that it was merely waiting for the right moment to unfold. Chapter 10. The Promise at Dawn. The days that followed the storm were a whirlwind of activity in the vineyard, the air heavy with the sweet, earthy scent of damp soil and ripe grapes. The autumn sun shone brightly, a gentle warmth permeating the cool breeze that swept across the rolling hills. Workers moved through the rows with renewed energy, laughter, and shouts of encouragement filling the air as the final harvest began in earnest. The sound of clinking baskets, the rustling of leaves, and the soft thuds of ripe fruit hitting the ground formed a symphony of autumn, vibrant and alive. Cecilia, too, felt the rejuvenation in the air, her spirits lifted by the rhythm of the harvest. She spent her days among the vines, painting the landscape as it transformed before her eyes, each brushstroke a testament to the beauty of the season. But even as she immersed herself in her art, her thoughts remained tethered to Luca, the lingering echoes of their connection both a source of inspiration and a quiet ache in her heart. On a bright afternoon, she found herself at the edge of the vineyard where the rows thinned and gave way to the broad expanse of sky. She stood on a small hill, the wind playing with her hair, and gazed out over the landscape, taking in the sprawling fields and the distant mountains that framed the horizon. It was a breathtaking view, one that had inspired her countless times, yet today it felt different, charged with an unspoken promise. As she turned back toward the vines, Cecilia caught sight of Luca, his tall figure moving gracefully among the workers. He was laughing with a group of harvesters, his smile infectious, and for a moment, the sight sent a jolt of warmth through her. She had come to recognize the moments when he was near, an inexplicable pull that drew her thoughts to him like gravity. But as she watched, she felt a pang of uncertainty tugging at her heart. Luca was so vibrant, so full of life, and she was aware of the weight of her own feelings, the fears and hopes that coiled within her, threatening to strangle the burgeoning connection they shared. She often found herself wondering if he felt the same, if he, too, was caught in the delicate web of unexpressed emotions that lingered between them. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the vineyard, Cecilia decided to seek solace in the olive grove. The memory of their earlier encounters there filled her with a mix of warmth and longing. She felt drawn to the ancient tree, its gnarled trunk a silent witness to their unspoken bond. Upon reaching the grove, she set down her easel and basket, inhaling the earthy aroma that enveloped her. She began to paint the scene around her, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating a mosaic of light and shadow on the ground. As her brush danced across the canvas, she poured her feelings into each stroke, capturing not just the beauty of the grove, but the essence of her heart's desire. Hours slipped away as she lost herself in the act of creation, the world around her fading into a gentle blur. She paused for a moment, glancing at the canvas filled with vibrant hues, a reflection of her hope and longing. Yet, even as she painted, the feeling of someone watching returned, a familiar sensation that made her heart race. She turned, half expecting to see Luca, but the grove was empty, save for the whisper of the wind through the leaves. As twilight descended, the sky transformed into a tapestry of deep blues and purples, stars twinkling to life in the vast expanse above. Cecilia packed her things slowly, relishing the tranquil beauty of the evening. The silence of the grove felt like a balm, soothing her turbulent thoughts. She took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs, the scent of damp earth mingling with the distant sweetness of ripening grapes. Just as she was about to leave, the sound of footsteps approached, firm yet careful on the path behind her. Cecilia's heart leaped in her chest, recognizing the presence she had been longing for. Luca emerged from the shadows, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun, casting a warm light on the contours of his features. He wore a look of quiet determination, and as their eyes met, an electric current sparked between them. In that moment, everything else faded away. The vineyard, the harvest, the weight of their unspoken words. It was just the two of them, standing under the ancient olive tree, the air thick with anticipation. Cecilia felt a rush of emotions, a blend of fear and hope swirling within her. She had dreamed of this moment, yet the reality was even more potent than she had imagined. Without breaking their gaze, Luca stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking until they stood within reach of each other. The world fell silent around them, the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the vineyard becoming a backdrop to the unspoken understanding that enveloped them. In that stillness, Cecilia felt her heart pounding in her chest, every beat a reminder of her desire. Luca reached out, his fingers brushing against the canvas she had just completed. He studied the painting, his eyes tracing the curves of color and light, and in that simple gesture, Cecilia felt the weight of their shared experiences, the bond they had formed through silence and art. She saw in his expression a reflection of her own feelings, a recognition of the journey they had both embarked on, and she felt a swell of gratitude rise within her. As if sensing her thoughts, Luca turned back to her, his gaze penetrating and warm. In the depths of his eyes, Cecilia saw the unspoken words that hung in the air between them, a promise of what could be. She felt a surge of courage, a longing to bridge the gap that had held them apart for too long. She stepped closer, her heart racing, her breath hitching in her throat. In that intimate moment, time stood still. The vineyard surrounding them felt alive, a witness to their shared truth. They had danced around their emotions long enough. Now it was time to embrace the possibility of love that lay before them. Without thinking, Cecilia closed the distance, reaching for Luca's hand. The contact sent a jolt of warmth through her, an electric connection that seemed to spark the air around them. She felt the tension of uncertainty dissolve, replaced by a sense of belonging that enveloped her like a soft embrace. Luca looked down at their intertwined fingers, a slow smile spreading across his face, illuminating his features with a joy that mirrored her own. And in that moment, as the stars began to emerge in the sky, they stood together, anchored by the understanding that their hearts had found a home in one another. Together, they moved back toward the villa, hand in hand, leaving behind the shadows of uncertainty. The night air was cool and refreshing, filled with the scent of ripening fruit and damp earth, a fitting backdrop for the new chapter they were about to write together. The vineyard stretched before them, a world rich with possibilities, and Cecilia felt a thrill of excitement course through her veins. As they walked, the moonlight bathed the path in a silver glow, illuminating their way. Each step felt lighter, filled with the promise of a shared future. The laughter of the harvesters echoed in the distance, a celebration of life and love, and in that moment, Cecilia realized that they were not just two souls crossing paths. They were part of something greater, a story woven into the very fabric of the vineyard. Arriving at the villa, they paused on the terrace, the sprawling view of the vineyard laid out before them, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. Cecilia turned to Luca, her heart racing, and in that gaze, she saw the potential of their journey together, the dreams that had begun to take root in her heart. They stood close, the silence wrapping around them like a warm blanket, a sense of peace settling in. In that shared moment, the world outside faded, leaving only the two of them suspended in time. As the stars twinkled above, they felt the weight of their unspoken promises, the understanding that the love they had nurtured in the quiet corners of the vineyard was blossoming into something beautiful. With a gentle smile, Luca leaned closer, his hand brushing against her cheek, and in that tender touch, Cecilia felt a surge of emotion that washed over her like a tide. They were no longer bound by hesitation or uncertainty. They had stepped into the light of a new beginning, where the whispers of the past met the hopeful embrace of tomorrow. In the heart of the vineyard, beneath the sheltering stars and the expansive sky, Cecilia knew that this was only the beginning. They had chosen each other, and with that choice came the promise of a love that would grow, flourish, and endure. Together, they would weave their stories, a tapestry of shared experiences, dreams, and moments that would last a lifetime. And as they stood on the terrace, hand in hand, the future stretched before them like the endless rows of vines, rich with possibility and ripe for the picking.